The shuttle's heavy airlock disengaged with a concussive shudder, followed immediately by the sterile, high-pitched hiss of equalizing pressure. The heavy blast doors parted, and Kira Vasquez stepped over the threshold onto the cold, gunmetal decking of Station Valith 9. She carried a single, faded canvas duffel bag slung over her right shoulder. It contained exactly 14 kilograms of mass, her issued uniforms, a hardened data pad, and the ghost of a dead woman. She had absolutely nothing else to her name. She stopped at the edge of the docking concourse and took a slow, measured breath. The air tasted wrong. It was artificially filtered, scrubbed by massive subterranean environmental units, recycled through miles of carbon weave piping, and entirely stripped of everything that made it feel alive. For the last 17 years of her life, Kira had drawn breath in the sweltering, lung-coating humidity of Sao Paulo. She knew the sharp smell of ozone right before a monsoon shattered the sky. She knew the stench of cracked asphalt, the metallic tang of blood, the desperate rhythm of dodging rainstorms and chasing feral stray dogs through the ruined, skeletal streets of a recovering Earth. Earth was a world of rot, rain, and chaotic, thrashing life. This place smelled only of refined tritanium and crushing silence. The docking bay stretched out before her, a cavernous industrial cathedral designed for species that had conquered the stars while humanity was still figuring out how to forge bronze. Massive transport ships and sleek interceptors from dozens of distant systems sat locked in neat, magnetic rows. Their armored hulls were scarred by the friction of vacuum dust, painted in iridescent, shifting colors that human retinas struggled to even process. The massive floor was a sea of movement. Alien students, the privileged children of generals, diplomats, and warlords from across the galaxy, moved through the transit concourse in tight, insular packs. Their voices were a chaotic, vibrating symphony of buzzing mandibles, clicking chitin, and multitonal songs that resonated uncomfortably in Kira's teeth. And they were watching her. She felt the shift in the room's kinetic energy before she directly saw it. A ripple of predatory awareness spread through the bay. As she walked, a group of towering, quadrupedal beings physically shifted their bodies, stepping backward as if avoiding a contagion. A cluster of scaled humanoids turned their heads in unison, their secondary eyelids snapping wide in whatever their biological equivalent of shock was. She was the anomaly, the glitch in the system, the only human on the station. The prestigious Galactic Concord Academy had never admitted a Deathwilder before. Kira was Earth's great, desperate experiment. The provisional human government had sent one 17-year-old girl across the dark expanse of space to prove, unequivocally, that humanity deserved a permanent seat among the stars instead of a place in the harvest pens. No pressure, she thought, burying the spike of anxiety deep in her gut. Kira kept her chin level, her dark eyes locked forward, refusing to dart around the room like cornered prey. She walked with the deliberate, measured stride of a soldier moving through a live minefield. At the registration desk, a tall, impossibly thin creature awaited her arrival. It possessed pale, translucent blue skin and 4 slender arms that ended in elongated, multi-jointed fingers. It leaned over the metallic console, studying her with massive, wet black eyes that blinked sideways with a sickeningly smooth motion. "You are the human," it said. The tone was completely flat, processed through Kira's cortical translator. It was not a question. "Kira Vasquez," she replied, her voice steady, revealing none of the adrenaline flooding her nervous system. She recognized the species from her grueling xenobiology holocasts, a Vanni. The creature did not offer a welcome. It simply reached out with 2 of its 4 arms and handed her a sliver of dark metal without another word. It was a data card, barely the size of her palm. Embedded within its microlattice was her entire existence on this station, her dormitory assignment, class schedule, station map, and the access codes she needed to simply survive. Following the station's internal navmesh, Kira descended. Her dormitory wasn't located in the grand upper rings with the vaulted ceilings and synthetic sunlight where the elite lived. The digital map took her down, deep into the station's lower intestine, past the humming coolant pipes and gravity generators to the lowest habitable wing. Room 408B. The doors parted with a sluggish scrape. The room was aggressively small, little more than a utilitarian closet, holding two recessed sleep pods built directly into the bulkhead and a cramped shared washing unit. Her doormate was already there. Selithia sat perched on the lower sleep pod, her long legs drawn up, all four of her slender arms crossed tightly over her chest in an internationally recognized gesture of defensive hostility. She was a Vanny, the exact same species as the registrar at the desk, but younger, smaller. Soft, bioluminescent patches clustered along the sides of her neck, currently pulsing a faint, anxious green. Selith stared at Kira. The look was a mixture of deep unease and visceral disgust, the exact way someone might look at a venomous, unidentifiable insect that had just crawled onto their dining plate. "So you are real," Selith said, her voice tight. "I thought they were joking when they told me I would be sharing a room with a Deathwilder." Kira stepped into the room. The door slid shut behind her, sealing them in. "I am real," Kira said, her tone devoid of offense or apology. She moved to the upper pod, hoisted her canvas bag onto the thin mattress, and unzipped it. There was not much to unpack, a fact that seemed to confuse the alien girl watching her. Kira pulled out a few sparse changes of training clothes, her hardened data pad, and a worn leather bracelet that smelled of old sweat and earth dirt. Finally, she withdrew a small, battered holographic projector. She set it on the narrow metal shelf beside her pillow and thumbed the activation switch. A palm-sized blue light flickered to life. It displayed a woman encased in scuffed, heavy human military armor. The woman was smiling, but her eyes were exhausted, haunted by things the camera couldn't capture. Selith watched the ritual intently, but said absolutely nothing about the photo. The bioluminescence on her neck dimmed to a cautious gray. She had seen something shift in the human girl's face when she looked at the projection, something hard, quiet, and terrifyingly far away. It was the look of a void, and Selith decided right then it was infinitely safer not to ask. The psychological pressure began to mount the very next morning. The Academy convened its mandatory orientation ceremony in the Grand Hall. It was a staggering architectural marvel. Over 1,000 students from the galaxy's premier warrior castes sat in curved, descending rows that rose toward the vaulted ceiling like the ridges inside a massive nautilus shell. Kira took a seat in the very back row, surrounded by a suffocating sea of alien bodies. The moment she sat, the whispers began. Students from dozens of species pointed, their voices a low drone of mockery and curiosity. To her left, a group of Seathani, towering insectoid creatures wrapped in natural armored plates, glowing marks pulsing aggressively on their throats, clicked their razor-sharp mandibles and stared at her with naked, open contempt. Down on the central dais, the Academy director took the podium. He was an ancient Velani, his bioluminescence dim and fading with age, his voice flowing through the hall's acoustics like slow, cold water. He welcomed the assembly. He spoke of the Academy's excellence, its blood-soaked, proud history, and the sacred honor of serving the galactic conquered military apparatus. Kira listened, her posture rigid, her breathing a shallow, controlled rhythm. Then, near the end of his address, the director paused. His black eyes scanned the upper rows. "This year," he said, his slow-water voice carrying a note of distinct weariness, "we welcome a student from a newly admitted species." He didn't look at Kira, he looked past her. "The Conquered has decided, in its wisdom, to extend this opportunity," he continued. "We trust that all students will accommodate this decision." That was it, no name, no mention of Earth, no real welcome, just a bureaucratic mandate to simply accommodate the fragile vermin in the room. Around her, the Seathani clicked in harsh amusement. The Vanny whispered. A massive Gorath to her right snorted, a sound like grinding boulders. Kira's face did not change. She sat perfectly still. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, her dark eyes completely steady, her breathing an even mechanical hum. If the director's public dismissal hurt, she didn't show it. She took the pain, folded it down until it was small and sharp, and buried it somewhere deep in her chest, in the exact same dark, lightless place she buried everything else. She was not here to be welcomed, she was here to survive. The first week was the hardest, but not because of the academic rigor. For 2 grueling years, Kira had forged herself into a weapon of pure retention. She had bled from the eyes studying alien syntax, military history, xenobiology, and multidimensional tactical theory until the data felt branded into her cerebral cortex. The hard part was the absolute, suffocating vacuum of everything else. The dining hall was a cavern of noise, but wherever Kira sat, a radius of empty space materialized. Nobody sat next to her. In the transit corridors, alien students physically moved to the opposite bulkhead to avoid her proximity. The physical testing began early. A hulking Sithani student deliberately clipped her shoulder in a tight corridor, his hardened chitin bruising her collarbone. He called out soft flesh in a booming, clicking dialect designed to carry, projecting his dominance to the gathered crowd. The resulting laughter from his pack was a sharp, grating sound, like jagged stones being struck together in a cave. Kira did not break stride. She did not respond. She did not even flinch. She simply walked steady and straight, her face a mask of terrifying blankness, acting as if they were entirely non-existent. This fractured their expectations. They had anticipated the fragile Death Wielder to display anger, fear, or tears. They received nothing. And nothing, it turned out, was profoundly harder for the galaxy to categorize than anything. In her rare, quiet moments, Kira did not rest. She mapped her cage. She methodically explored the sprawling station. She committed the labyrinthine corridors, hidden maintenance exits, and precise distances between key junction rooms to memory. She noted every environmental variable, ambient temperature shifts, microgravity fluctuations, and atmospheric gas mixes. More importantly, she studied the alien student body the exact way a predatory biologist studies animals in the wild. She observed their feeding habits, mapped their hierarchical social structures, and meticulously catalogued their physical blind spots and weaknesses. She did this instinctively, without conscious thought. It was how her mind was built. It was how all humans were built, an evolutionary trait the wider galaxy did not yet possess the capacity to understand. Doubt crept in only at night. On the fifth evening, the sterile blue glow of her data pad illuminated her face as Selith returned to their cramped room. "You have combat theory tomorrow," Selith said, her voice careful, laced with a new kind of tension. "With Instructor Keller, I know he is Sithani, one of the most decorated soldiers in the Conquered. He has killed." Selith hesitated, her bioluminescence flickering. "He has fought in many battles." "I know who he is," Kira replied smoothly. The absolute lack of fear or anger in Kira's voice made the young Vanny freeze. What Selith heard was something older, something patient, cold, and utterly terrifying, like stone worn razor-smooth by decades of rushing water. Kira shut off the data pad and lay back, staring into the dark ceiling. Beside her, the holographic image of her mother glowed faintly, a woman in armor, frozen alive in a moment before the universe collapsed. Kira closed her eyes, preparing to sit in a classroom and be taught war by the exact creature who had taken her mother from her. She would sit, she would listen, she would not speak, but she would remember every single breath he took. The combat theory lecture hall was an architectural intimidation tactic. It was built like an immense gladiatorial arena. Steep rows of seating encircled a central stage, while above them floated a massive, high-fidelity holographic projector capable of rendering entire planetary battlefields in sharp, glowing detail. Over 200 elite students filled the seats, Kaithani, Vayani, Gorith, and a dozen other apex species, all staring at the stage with the eager, bloodthirsty attention of children waiting for a slaughter. Instructor Vierkelze did not disappoint. He entered the stage like he owned the very air in the room. He was a nightmare of biological engineering, standing over 7 feet tall, his massive frame encased in dark, interlocking kitten plates that clicked with a heavy, metallic menace when he moved. His arms were thick trunks of armored muscle ending in four-fingered hands explicitly designed to crush bone. His throat pulsed with bioluminescent markings that shifted color with his internal mood, currently broadcasting a confident, steady gold. "Welcome," his deep, resonant voice boomed, effortlessly filling the cavernous hall, "to the only class that matters." The students barked with laughter. Kelze smiled, or contorted his jagged mandibles into a shape that passed for one. He immediately launched into the species hierarchy of combat, a brutal ranking of the galaxy's military value. He used horrific historical battles as his textbook, projecting burning ships in the vacuum of space, ground forces being eviscerated on alien soil, and entire cities falling into ash. Naturally, he placed the Seathani at the pinnacle. "My people were born for war," he bellowed, striking his massive chest plate with a sound like a war drum. "Our armor is natural. Our reflexes are faster than most species can think. We do not break." He dismissed the Velani as mere bureaucrats useful only for writing treaties after the real work was done, and openly mocked the towering Gorath as strong but painfully slow, like boulders that dream of being soldiers. The Gorath students shifted in deep discomfort, but said nothing. Kelza was too famous, too decorated, and far too powerful to challenge. Then the holographic projection shifted above the stage. A small, fragile-looking planet materialized, swirling with blue oceans and white clouds. Earth, Kira's home, hung above them like an exposed jewel. Kelza stared at it with the distinct expression of someone analyzing a dead, rotting insect. "Humans," he sneered, the word dripping from his mandibles like venom. "The galaxy's newest curiosity, a Class 12 Deathworld species." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "Impressive in the way that a disease is impressive, hard to kill, but ultimately insignificant." Scattered, clicking laughter echoed through the arena. With a dismissive wave of his armored hand, the display morphed. The blue jewel dissolved into a gritty, dusty human settlement, prefabricated buildings scattered across a windswept, desolate plain, the quintessential frontier outpost. 12 years ago, before the ceasefire, the Cathani expansion fleet conducted operations along the border of human-claimed space, Kelza said casually, as if recounting a mild, long-forgotten vacation. "I was there. I will give them this. They fought. They screamed and they bled, and they fired their primitive weapons until the barrels melted, but they broke. They always broke." His throat markings flared a brilliant, arrogant gold. Shaky, chaotic combat footage flooded the massive projector, a nighttime slaughter of explosions, running figures, and the distant, agonizing audio of human voices screaming in fear and pain. Kira's mind snapped to the visual data. She recognized the layout instantly, the grid pattern of the prefab barracks, the central communications tower, and the perimeter wall that had been violently torn open on the eastern flank. It was Outpost Meridian 7. She had studied the classified reports, memorized the casualty lists, and etched every detail into her soul, because that dark, bloody dirt was where her mother had died fighting enemies she could barely see. "I personally led the third assault wave," Kelza boasted, visibly savoring the memory. His mandibles twitched with dark satisfaction. "The human soldiers were brave, I suppose, in the way that small animals are brave when cornered, but bravery is not enough when you are soft." He raised his massive hand into the harsh arena light, turning it slowly. "I carry their dents as decoration." The hall erupted in louder, crueler laughter. In the back row, Kira Vasquez had not moved a single millimeter. Her hands rested perfectly flat on her desk, fingers spread, her posture rigidly aligned. Her face betrayed absolute zero. 2 rows ahead, Selith glanced back and felt a sudden, icy terror wash through her veins. Kira's knuckles were bone white, the tendons beneath her skin straining like industrial steel cables. Kelza finally locked onto her. He had been building to this execution since he walked in. "Ah," he rumbled, extending a lethal armored finger toward the back row. "Our visiting specimen, stand-up human." Kira rose. The motion was not fast, but smooth, like deep water rising in a locked chamber. "Tell me," Kelza mocked, his mandibles clicking rapidly with amusement, "does your species even teach combat, or do you simply die in creative ways and call it strategy?" The room exploded. Alien students slammed their desks, flashing bioluminescent joy at the absolute humiliation of the Deathworlder. Kira simply stood there, arms at her sides, perfectly balanced, her dark eyes drilling a hole directly through Kelza's skull. She waited until the laughter completely died. "Which outpost?" she asked. Kelza tilted his massive head. "What? You said you led an assault. Which outpost?" He blinked his secondary eyelids slowly. "Outpost Meridian 7, a forgettable place." "And the commanding officer?" Kira pressed, her voice cutting through the dead air. Do you remember the name? Kelzer waved his hand in irritation. Humans all look the same to me. Does it matter? Commander Elena Vasquez, Kira stated. Her tone was flat, heavy, and lethal, like a carbon steel blade laid quietly on a metal table. She held the eastern wall for 7 hours with 32 soldiers against your third wave. Your reports listed 109 Sithani casualties before the wall fell. The entire arena stopped breathing. Kelzer's golden throat markings violently flickered to a darker, uncertain hue. She was my mother, Kira said. The silence was absolute. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Kira calmly sat down. Kelzer stared at her for a long, agonizing moment before forcing a harsh, clicking laugh, dismissing her statement as human sentiment, a fundamental weakness. But as he resumed his lecture, his voice was too loud, his gestures too wide, desperately trying to fill a space that had suddenly become far too large. After class, the students evacuated in unnatural silence. Selith caught up to Kira in the corridor, asking if she was all right. I am fine, he was there. Wenna, I know what he did, Kira replied. Selith watched the human walk away, steady, straight, and unhurried. Kira wasn't retreating, she was walking towards something. That night, the lights in room 408B remained off. The holographic phantom of Elena Vasquez cast a pale glow across Kira's face. Kira stared at her mother for a long time, then initiated her data pad. She bypassed her standard coursework and pulled up every existing file on Instructor Breth Kelzer, his combat decorations, tactical writings, and unredacted service records. She opened Sithani physiological databases, mapping skeletal structures, nerve cluster locations, joint flexibility limitations, and chitin density variables. For hours, she read, took notes, and memorized. Inside that tiny pod, a 17-year-old girl from a broken world began dissecting the body of the creature who had murdered her mother. She would not stop until she knew him infinitely better than he knew himself. In the weeks that followed, Kira Vasquez changed. It was not a visible metamorphosis that the alien student body could track. She still sat entirely isolated in the cavernous dining hall, still navigated the metallic corridors with her single canvas bag and her terrifyingly quiet face, and still spoke only when directly spoken to. But beneath the flesh, something fundamental had violently shifted. It was like a subterranean river, silently altering its course beneath solid bedrock, and the catastrophic effects began to bleed into the open in ways no one anticipated. The galaxy was about to learn that human resolve did not look like screaming rage. It looked like cold, mechanical perfection. It started in the testing chambers. Combat theory at the Academy was not mere brawling. It was a brutal gauntlet of multi-layered tactical problems encompassing supply logistics, xenobiology, military history, and strategic planning. Instructor Breth Kelzer engineered his examinations to be intellectual slaughterhouses, demanding students think across deeply ingrained species boundaries to survive. Apex predators struggled under the pressure. The absolute best students in the Academy scored in the high 70s. Kira scored a 98 on the first exam, on the second, a 96, on the third, a flawless 100. Breth retaliated through the grading margins. He marked her data files with extreme vindictive prejudice, bleeding her scores for formatting deviations, minor word choices, and tactical answers that were technically flawless but lacked what he deemed elegance. It was a futile gesture. It simply did not matter. Kira was so mathematically far ahead of the alien student body that even bearing his heavy penalties, she sat unchallenged at the absolute top of every academic ranking. Breth entirely stopped calling on her during live lectures. She had methodically stripped that weapon from his hands. Every time he had tried to publicly embarrass the Death Wielder with an impossibly complex question, she had answered it perfectly, calmly, and without a microscopic fraction of hesitation. The mocking cliques of the alien students faded. They no longer laughed when Breth mentioned humans. Then the Academy transitioned to physical assessments, and the true psychological fracture began. The curriculum mandated testing across a punishing spectrum: speed, raw strength, endurance, reflexes, and environmental survival. The galactic hierarchy was built on specialized biology. The Sithani possessed terrifying armored speed. The Gorith were impossibly strong. The Vellani moved with liquid, precise agility. Nobody possessed the necessary data to evaluate a human. The first anomaly occurred during the endurance run. The gauntlet was a brutal 5-kilometer track engineered to loop through fluctuating gravity zones and hostile atmospheric shifts. Most apex species redline their biology to complete the circuit in 15 to 20 minutes. The Seathani elite finished in an astonishing 12 minutes, their heavy chitin-plated legs driving them across the finish line with ruthless mechanical efficiency. Kira crossed the line at 14 minutes. It was a highly respectable metric, but decidedly not exceptional. The Seathani cluster clicked their mandibles in arrogant amusement. Then, while the Seathani bent over, their armored torsos heaving as they gasped for oxygen and frantically flexed their overheated joints, Kira did not stop. She kept running. She ran the brutal circuit again, and again, and again. 2 grueling hours later, the monitoring instructor, a deeply bewildered Vellani, finally ordered her to halt. Kira was barely breathing hard. Her heart rate was elevated but locked into a steady, unbreakable rhythm. Her skin was slick with sweat, a biological thermal regulation response that actively disgusted most observing alien species, yet served as an incredibly efficient, relentless cooling system. She could have kept running for hours. The Cathani students were no longer laughing. The statistical impossibilities escalated. During the strength matrix, Kira matched the mid-tier Gorith students in raw grip strength, applying physical leverage that should have been biomechanically impossible for a creature her size. A massive Gorith named Dorvak, a towering figure with stone-gray skin and surprisingly gentle eyes, watched her casually crush the pressure device. "Interesting," he rumbled quietly. In the hazard simulations, they locked her inside chambers, replicating lethal toxicity, extreme thermal spikes, radiation, and suffocating low oxygen. Kira adapted faster than students whose species had evolved specifically for those exact conditions. When a Vani monitor demanded to know how she remained conscious after the oxygen level plummeted to a fatal 7%, Kira simply shrugged. "Humans climb mountains higher than that for fun," she said flatly. The instructor had to access the galactic network to translate the word mountain. When she read the geographic data, she was visibly horrified. The rumors spread like an airborne pathogen. In the sterile library, in the shadowed corridors, and in the quiet spaces between classes, the student body began whispering about the human with a new, deeply unsettling kind of attention. The jokes about her soft flesh grew far less frequent. Something was happening that the galaxy's comfortable assumptions about humanity simply could not explain. Dorvak cornered her one evening in the silent archives. Nearly 3 times her size, he moved with careful precision, terrified of shattering the furniture. He placed a heavy data pad on the table between them. "I have been reading about your species," the stone-skinned giant said. "I found something called persistence hunting. Is it real?" Kira locked eyes with him. "It is real. Your ancestors chased animals across open ground," Dorvak recited, his deep voice trembling slightly. "Not by being faster, not by being stronger, just by not stopping. The animal would sprint ahead, then rest. Your ancestors would follow. The animal would sprint again. Your ancestors would follow again for hours, for days, until the animal's body simply gave up." "That is correct," Kira said. Dorvak was quiet for a moment. His stone-like face was hard to read, but something flickered in his deep-set eyes. "That is the most terrifying thing I have ever heard," he said. "We are very patient," Kira replied, almost smiling, almost. Back in the dim isolation of room 408B, Selith finally began to ask questions. Kira did not hide the nightmare of her homeworld. She described oceans that covered 70% of the planet and contained creatures capable of swallowing a shuttle whole. She detailed the weather, hurricanes that flattened cities, lightning that split the sky, and winters that froze the ground solid for months. She listed the invisible wars, the bacteria, venomous parasites, and poisonous flora. Selith pressed all 4 hands to her mouth. "Your planet is trying to kill you," she whispered, "every single day." "Yes," Kira said simply, "that is why we are the way we are." The ultimate test of this terrifying resolve arrived during the semester's live tactical simulation, a massive, high-stakes war game spanning the station's vast training complex. It was the absolute crucible of the term. Breth Kelzer held total administrative control, and he assigned the teams himself. He engineered Kira's squad to fail catastrophically. He handed Kira the weakest squad in the academy, 3 Vayani who had never scored above average, and a single Gorath known solely for writing poetry rather than shedding blood. He deliberately dropped them into the worst strategic starting position on the map and handed them an objective that tactical algorithms calculated as mathematically impossible. The simulation initiated at dawn. The parameters dictated an 8-hour engagement. It lasted 19. Kira did not attempt to win through brute force. She refused to charge the objective. Instead, she immediately weaponized her species' darkest evolutionary trait. She kept her fragile, terrified team in constant, grinding motion. They changed vectors, laid false thermal trails, totally avoided direct engagement, and relentlessly circled back. She squeezed utility out of every microshadow and every shifting environmental variable. They ingested their nutrient rations while walking. They slept in violently brief, 15-minute staggered shifts. They absolutely never stopped moving. The opposing forces, larger, faster, heavily armed, and deeply arrogant, burned massive amounts of biological energy aggressively hunting her. The Thani-led Apex team, the absolute favorites to slaughter the human, pushed their bodies to the absolute limit for the first 10 hours. Then they began to slow. By hour 14, their mechanical efficiency degraded into staggering exhaustion. By hour 17, their compromised nervous systems were committing critical, fatal tactical errors. At hour 19, the proud Thani captain, a warrior who had never tasted defeat in a single simulation, collapsed into the dirt and formally surrendered his squad. Kira's broken, misfit team had conquered the elite by simply refusing to stop. The academy buzzed for days. Students who had once ignored Kira now watched her with an entirely new, fearful reverence. The galaxy was finally realizing they had locked a predator inside their own cage. Meanwhile, Breth Kelzer was violently losing control of his carefully constructed reality, and the bitter truth was that he knew it. The human girl had been designated as a bureaucratic joke, a fragile political stunt imported by out-of-touch diplomats. She was supposed to be a highly convenient prop, a trembling biological entity he could casually break to publicly demonstrate the absolute superiority of the galaxy's true warrior species. Instead, she was methodically dismantling his supreme authority, one flawless exam score and broken simulation at a time. He retaliated by pushing harder. He weaponized the curriculum against her. He assigned Kira punishing extra simulations, engineering nightmare scenarios specifically designed to be statistically impossible. She completed every single one. He publicly humiliated her during physical drills, aggressively criticizing her combat form in front of the assembled class, screaming out every microscopic flaw. She absorbed the abuse and silently corrected each exact metric by the very next session. He buried her under an avalanche of additional tactical readings, logistical reports, and multi-system analyses, enough raw data to crush 3 elite students. She processed it all without a single complaint, without a fractional error, and entirely without expression. That was the psychological fracture that bothered him most. Breth could handle defiance. He had physically and mentally broken thousands of defiant students and enemy combatants before. He could handle fear, as fear was a natural, highly useful biological mechanism. But Kira Vasquez gave him absolutely nothing. When he screamed at her, she just looked at him with those dark, terrifyingly steady eyes. There was no anger, there was no respect, there was no hatred or admiration. There was simply nothing. Standing before her felt exactly like staring down into deep, black water and realizing, with a cold shudder, that there was no bottom. 3 days after the disastrous 19-hour tactical simulation, the pressure in Breth's mind finally snapped. The entire academy was buzzing with the impossible result. Elite students who had once ignored Kira now watched her with an entirely new, fearful reverence. Instructors were analyzing her performance in locked private meetings. Even the elite conquered officials who monitored the academy from the upper rings had taken serious notice. Breath took notice too, but it was a deeply personal, toxic mutation of his pride. He cornered her in a dim, isolated maintenance corridor. His massive, armored body deliberately blocked the narrow path, casting a heavy shadow over her small frame. His bioluminescent throat markings were pulsing a violent, angry red. "You think you have proven something, human?" His voice vibrated off the metal bulkheads, a low, incredibly dangerous mechanical growl. "You have proven nothing. A simulation is not war." He leaned forward, the sharp edges of his natural kitten armor scraping against the corridor walls. "I have killed things stronger than you with my bare hands." Kira slowly tilted her head back to look up at him. The very top of her skull barely reached the center of his armored chest, yet her heart rate did not spike. Her breathing remained a slow, deliberate metronome. She did not step back. She did not look away. Instead, she studied his massive form the exact way she studied everything else on the station, carefully, completely, and without an ounce of hurry. "I know exactly what you have killed, Instructor," she said quietly. Without another word, she seamlessly stepped around his massive, rigid body and simply walked away down the corridor. Breath was left standing alone in the empty, humming hallway. His bioluminescent throat markings began to flicker erratically, glitching and shifting through panicked spectrums of colors he could no longer consciously control. Something terribly cold had suddenly settled deep inside his armored chest, an alien sensation he had not experienced in decades of brutal warfare across 12 different star systems. He did not even recognize the biological chemical response at first, because he had never felt it before. It was doubt. Doubt demanded a public execution. Every semester, the Academy held a highly publicized combat demonstration. It was a massive, formal event where elite instructors physically showcased lethal fighting techniques using volunteer students as sparring partners. High-ranking dignitaries, military officials, ambassadors, and representatives from dozens of conquered worlds traveled across the galaxy to fill the grand amphitheater in their finest ceremonial attire. It was equal parts educational doctrine and brutal entertainment, rendering it the most watched, highest-stakes event in the Academy's entire calendar. Breath Kelzer had been the undisputed star of the bloody demonstration for 9 consecutive years. Traditionally, he would select a promising student, spar within strictly controlled conditions, and use the brief match to illustrate superior combat principles. The students were never expected to win. The sole point was for the galactic elite to watch the master butcher at work. Breath was always careful, surgically precise, and visually devastating. He made the violence look effortless, and the aristocratic crowds loved him for it. But this year, his fractured pride demanded a slaughter. He announced a radical deviation from protocol. He declared he would actively demonstrate cross-species combat superiority in a live sparring match against absolutely any student willing to volunteer. There would be zero restrictions on species. It would be full contact within the extreme edges of the medical safety parameters. He framed the brutal challenge as an open educational opportunity. Every single being on the station knew exactly who he was targeting. The night before the demonstration, the air in room 408B was heavy with the scent of impending trauma. Selith sat frozen on her sleep pod, watching Kira prepare her body. The human girl was undergoing a stretching routine, executing slow, hyper-deliberate movements that bent her skeletal structure in ways Selith found biologically alarming. The sheer mechanical flexibility of the human form was deeply disturbing to the alien. "You cannot do this," Selith finally said, her voice trembling. "He will hurt you. The demonstration rules protect the instructor. He can use full force, and the medical team will only intervene if your life is at risk." She gestured frantically with all 4 arms. "That gives him a wide range of damage to work with." Kira smoothly folded her torso forward, touching her toes with flat palms. "I know the rules," she said, her voice muffled against her knees. Selith slid off the pod, packing the cramped floor. "He weighs 200 kg more than you. His kitten can stop blade strikes. His reaction time is nearly twice yours." She stopped, staring at the girl. "He has fought and killed across 12 systems. You are a student." Kira rose back to a perfectly balanced standing position. "I know all of that too." Selith made a sharp, panicked sound of sheer frustration, a high, vibrating whistling note tearing from her vanny throat. "Then why?" she demanded. Kira stopped stretching. She slowly sat down cross-legged on the cold metal floor and looked up at her roommate with those dark, terrifyingly still eyes. "I know his species' binocular vision has a processing delay of 0.3 seconds when tracking lateral movement below chest height," Kira recited, the data flowing from her mouth like icy water. "I know that Seathani joints lose 40% of their flexibility when the ambient temperature drops below 18 degrees. She tilted her head. "The amphitheater's climate system runs at 16. Selith stopped breathing. "I know the nerve cluster density beneath his third and seventh thoracic plates," Kira continued relentlessly, her voice devoid of emotion. "And I know that targeted pressure on those points causes involuntary muscle spasms." She leaned forward slightly. "I know his fighting style from 23 recorded matches. He favors a right-side lunge on his opening move. He drops his left guard after the second strike, and he has never fought an opponent shorter than his shoulder line." She paused, letting the devastating tactical reality sink into the alien's mind. "I have been ready for 6 weeks." Selith stared at the tiny, fragile Deathwilder, completely paralyzed by the calculating horror of what the human had actually been doing in the dark. Across the small room, the heavy doors had silently slid open. Dorvac, the massive Gorith who had come to the lower wings to gently wish Kira luck, stood entirely frozen in the dimly lit doorway. His deep, stone-grey face was completely unreadable as he processed the cold, mathematical dissection of the Academy's greatest killer. "Persistence predator," the giant whispered into the silence. The amphitheater was a colossal monument to martial vanity. Over 3,000 spectators crammed into the steeply rising, curved rows of seating, creating a suffocating canopy of alien breath and shifting armor. Students, faculty, military dignitaries, and conquered representatives buzzed with a predatory, electric anticipation. Holographic recording drones floated silently above the immaculate, circular arena floor, broadcasting the imminent slaughter to screens across the station and out into the wider network of the Galactic Conquered. This was not an educational seminar. It was an execution disguised as curriculum. It was the most anticipated demonstration in years, and every single being in the stadium knew exactly why. Brethkelzer entered first, and the crowd roared. He strode out from the heavy iron gate, wearing his ceremonial combat gear, the polished, artificial kitten plates layered over his natural organic armor gleaming under the harsh, multi-spectrum arena lights. He walked with a slow, exaggerated, rolling gait, savoring the intoxicating rush of the crowd's adulation. The bioluminescent markings pulsing thickly across his muscular throat burned a deep, confident gold, radiating absolute, unshakable dominance. He raised one massive, armored hand to acknowledge the amphitheater, milking the applause for every drop of its worth. Then he planted himself at the dead center of the vast arena floor, lowered his hand, and bellowed his call for a volunteer. The resulting silence was immediate and absolute. The crowd waited. Elite alien students nervously looked at each other, stared rigidly at the floor, or inspected their own claws, looking absolutely anywhere but at the blood-stained arena. Then Kira stood. She rose from the upper rows, a tiny, solitary figure against the massive, brutalist architecture. She walked slowly down the long stone steps, wearing nothing but the Academy's standard, unarmored training uniform. It was thin, gray fabric. It offered zero impact protection, zero thermal regulation, and zero camouflage. She was staggeringly small against the backdrop of the enormous, cavernous arena, and her soft, cloth-wrapped footsteps made absolutely no sound against the stone. A low, vibrating murmur of disbelief rippled violently through the crowd. Several predatory students leaned forward, their mandibles twitching. High in the VIP section, a decorated conquered official leaned over to his colleague and muttered, "This will be quick." Kira stepped smoothly onto the pristine arena floor. She walked until exactly 15 meters separated her from the towering instructor, and then she stopped. She tilted her head back and looked up at him. He looked down at her. The physical size disparity was almost comical. Brethkelzer was a walking, breathing wall of reinforced kitten, dense muscle, and military-grade lethality. Kira was a Deathworld girl who weighed exactly 60 kilograms on a good day. Breath's jagged mandibles clicked in deep, genuine amusement. "Brave," he rumbled, his deep voice carrying effortlessly so the entire ravenous crowd could hear. "Foolish but brave." At the edge of the ring, the match referee, a neutral, heavily augmented official, raised his hand high into the air and brought it down violently. "Begin." Breath lunged instantly. It was his signature opening maneuver, the exact right-side charge Kira had watched him execute on holo recordings night after night in the dark. He closed the massive 15-meter gap in two impossibly fast, terrifyingly long strides, leading with his thickly armored right shoulder. It was a kinetic strike, explicitly designed to overwhelm the nervous system, to violently crush skeletal structure, and to definitively end the fight before the opponent's brain even registered the threat. He had weaponized that exact maneuver 100 times against 100 different opponents, and it had never once failed. But Kira was not there. She moved left. She dropped incredibly low and accelerated fast, slipping entirely below his chest line. It was the exact microscopic mathematical angle where Breath's binocular vision suffered a biological processing delay, rendering him momentarily blind to her lateral shift. Breath's massive, armored shoulder slammed into completely empty air. His own tremendous momentum dragged him dangerously forward. He grunted, violently twisted his torso to recalibrate his target lock, and struck out again with a sweeping backhand that could shatter concrete. She was already somewhere else. The roaring amphitheater went dead quiet. Kira did not fight the way the master instructor or the thousands of spectators expected. She refused to stand her ground. She completely rejected any attempt to mathematically match his overwhelming kinetic power or his terrifying armored speed. Instead, she existed in a state of constant fluid motion. She executed low lateral shifts, engineered sudden, violent direction changes, and seamlessly circled behind his massive bulk, constantly reappearing precisely on his weak side. Every single microscopic movement was ruthlessly precise. Every step was a cold, calculated mathematical equation. She danced just millimeters outside of his lethal reach, yet remained firmly planted inside the radius of his mounting psychological frustration. Breath swung a massive fist. He missed. He swung again, roaring with effort. He missed. His mandibles began clicking with a furious, growing agitation. The bioluminescence on his throat violently shifted from a confident gold to a dark, angry orange. 3 agonizing minutes passed, then 5, then 7. The massive crowd watched in a state of stunned, paralyzed silence as the galaxy's absolute most decorated, lethal combat instructor completely failed to land a single, grazing blow on a 17-year-old girl in a thin fabric suit. Kira was not attacking, not yet. She was a predator gathering environmental data. She was watching, reading, waiting. Every single missed kinetic strike told her something new. Every desperate shift of his massive weight, every furious twitch of his mandibles, every erratic flicker of his shifting throat markings actively added vital data to the complex tactical map she had meticulously constructed in her mind over 6 brutal weeks of study. She was actively learning the architecture of his body in real time, and the terrifying truth was that Breath simply did not possess the cognitive capacity to understand what was happening to him. At the 10-minute mark, the biological reality of the arena hit. Breath began to visibly slow down. The amphitheater's massive, humming climate control system held the ambient temperature precisely at 16 degrees Celsius, exactly 2 degrees below the critical biological threshold Kira had identified weeks ago. His massive, armored joints were actively stiffening. His kinetic movements, which had started out as fluid and explosively violent, became noticeably heavier, dragging with a lethargic friction. His breathing grew horribly loud, echoing off the arena walls as a harsh, rasping click dragged from deep within his exhausted thorax. He was a weapon biologically engineered for short, brutal, overwhelming engagements. Overwhelming kinetic force, applied violently and quickly, that was the sacred Sithani way. They were absolutely not built for this. They were not designed for a grinding, psychological war of attrition that simply would not end against an opponent who refused to stand still, who refused to be where the tactical algorithms dictated she should be. It was persistence hunting, brutally applied to single, close-quarters combat. At the 12-minute mark, Kira finally struck. It was not a dramatic, cinematic blow. It was not a kinetically powerful, bone-breaking hit. It was a surgical, perfectly precise open-palmed strike driven directly into the microscopic gap between Breath's third and fourth thoracic plates. It was the exact coordinate where she knew the central nerve cluster sat, the exact millimeter where his impenetrable kitten armor was thinnest. Breath violently flinched. A small, totally involuntary tremor ran rapidly through his entire left side. She pivoted and struck again, different physiological coordinate, exact same terrifying precision. She hammered the nerve cluster buried beneath his seventh plate. His massive, armored left leg buckled under his own weight for a fraction of a second. The crowd gasped as one. Breath snapped. He roared, a sound of pure, unadulterated fury that violently shook the arena floor, a deep, thunderous vibration that literally made the cold air tremble. He swung his heavy arms wildly, totally abandoning all military technique, abandoning all tactical strategy, driven exclusively by something primal, blind, and deeply desperate. He was no longer fighting a controlled, educational demonstration match. He was violently fighting for his shattered pride, his legendary reputation, and his core identity as an apex killer, a conqueror, the very nightmare that other alien species fundamentally feared. Kira effortlessly sidestepped his blind, desperate charge. She smoothly hooked her soft, unarmored foot directly behind his heavy leading ankle. It was a jarringly simple, ancient mechanical technique that human children learned playing in schoolyard dirt fights, and Breath's own staggering, uncontrolled momentum did the rest of the devastating work. He crashed heavily to the arena floor. The concussive impact physically shook the massive stone amphitheater. A thick, choking cloud of dust violently rose into the air around his sprawling, armored body. Before the giant could even attempt to rise, Kira was already on him. She drove one hand deep into the vulnerable nerve junction directly beneath his jaw, brutally engaging the Sithani paralysis point she had meticulously studied in glowing medical texts and anatomical databases night after night in her claustrophobic dormitory pod. She rigidly braced her other hand directly against his heavy thoracic plate, physically holding the 200-kilogram monster pinned to the floor using pure mechanical leverage rather than raw muscular strength. Breath was completely paralyzed. He could not move a single millimeter. His massive body had instantly locked, every single muscle fiber frozen in rigid agony. His bioluminescent throat was flickering wildly, flashing erratically between desperate, panicked colors, red, white, purple, black. It was an involuntary Sithani distress signal, a biological scream of pure terror that absolutely no one in the sprawling arena had ever seen emanate from the legendary warrior before. The massive amphitheater was dead silent. 3,000 apex beings completely held their breath. Kira leaned her face close to the floor. Her lips hovered mere millimeters from the side of his heavy head, precisely where the Sithani auditory membrane was anatomically thinnest. She spoke quietly, so quietly that only the monster pinned beneath her could hear the words. "Outpost Meridian 7, she whispered into the silence. "Commander Elena Vasquez." Breath's eyes, all four of them, were blown wide, frozen in absolute, unblinking terror, staring blankly at nothing. "She held the eastern wall for 7 hours. Kira's voice was a cold, lethal blade. "She killed 39 of your soldiers before she fell. She was my mother." The creature beneath her trembled against the cold stone floor. "She did not break easily," Kira whispered, the absolute finality of the statement hanging in the cold air. "And neither did I." Kira slowly released the mechanical pressure on the paralyzed nerve junction. She stood, the muscles in her legs trembling slightly under the violent crash of fadding adrenaline, and stepped back from the massive, immobile form of Breath Kelzer. The legendary instructor did not attempt to get up. Beneath the harsh stadium lights, his bioluminescent throat markings completely dimmed, bleeding into a faint, trembling gray, the absolute, undeniable Sithani biological indicator of total surrender. For exactly 3 seconds, the universe held entirely still. There was absolutely no sound, no movement. Then high in the stands, the massive Gorith named Dorvac stood up. His heavy stone hands came together with a concussive sound like rolling thunder. Beside him, Selith rose to her feet, the bioluminescent patches on her neck blazing a brilliant, blinding white, the highest Vanni expression of pure awe. One by one, row by row, the massive amphitheater erupted. Beings from dozens of conquered worlds who had never culturally agreed on a single thing rose to their feet and filled the cavernous arena with a deafening wall of sound. Down on the blood-stained floor, Kira stood completely alone. She did not smile. She did not raise her bruised hands in victory. She simply breathed in, breathed out, and stared down at the precise place where breath lay completely broken, not just in physical body, but in absolutely everything he had ever arrogantly believed about himself and the supposedly fragile creatures from the little blue world. High above in the VIP section, a panicked conquered official quietly opened a classified security file on his data pad. With trembling fingers, he deleted the old title, Humanity, Provisional Assessment, and frantically typed a new one, Humanity Threat Reassessment Priority Alpha. The tactical footage violently breached the Academy's closed network and reached every single dark corner of the galaxy within 6 hours. Someone in the amphitheater had recorded the entire brutal dissection on a personal device, uploading the raw file to public networks long before the Academy's administration could attempt to control the narrative. By the time the communications office realized the catastrophic breach, the raw video had already been copied, shared, translated, and obsessively analyzed by billions of beings across thousands of interconnected worlds. The entire galaxy had just watched a 17-year-old human girl surgically dismantle the absolute most decorated combat instructor in the conquered military, and it simply could not stop talking about it. Elite military analysts from 12 different apex species immediately published exhaustive breakdowns of Kira's horrific technique. They studied her microscopic footwork, her impossible timing, and her lethal, encyclopedic knowledge of Sithani internal physiology. A retired Gorith general publicly called the bout the most sophisticated application of species-specific tactical exploitation he had seen in 40 years of service. A brilliant Vanni combat theorist rapidly published a paper titled Endurance as Weapon the Human Paradigm, which instantly became the most downloaded academic publication of the entire quarter. The political shockwaves moved even faster, tearing through the bureaucratic infrastructure. Within 3 days of the bloody match, the Galactic Conquered High Command opened a formal, sweeping investigation into instructor Breth Kelzer. His years of arrogant boasting in the lecture halls, his proud, highly detailed stories of slaughtering human soldiers during the border conflicts, had all been meticulously recorded by the Academy's own internal archival systems. What he had casually treated as glorious war stories, the conquered legal office now treated as devastating, unassailable evidence. The strict ceasefire agreement between the Sithani expansion fleet and the human frontier colonies had included rigid terms regarding the conduct of hostilities. Breth's own arrogant accounts of his actions at Outpost Meridian 7 suggested horrific, systemic violations, the deliberate targeting of marked medical facilities, the execution of wounded personnel, and the intentional destruction of civilian shelters. He had confessed to these war crimes openly, proudly, in front of hundreds of alien students, simply because he had never possessed the imagination to believe that anyone in the galaxy would ever care about the deaths of a few fragile humans. He was fatally wrong. Breth was permanently stripped of his teaching position on the 4th day. His legendary combat decorations were immediately suspended pending review, and he was confined to quarters, formally informed he would face a brutal military tribunal within the month. On Earth and out in the dusty frontier colonies where human settlers had lived under the terrifying shadow of Sithani aggression for over a decade, people watched the footage of the girl from Sao Paulo standing over the fallen body of their nightmare. They felt a profound, burning pride they had not felt in a very long time. But Kira did not feel proud. She only felt a crushing, hollow exhaustion. She aggressively declined every single media interview request that flooded the station from across 30 systems. In the massive dining hall, the alien students no longer moved away from her. They even cleared a space for her at the prestigious center tables, the seats strictly reserved for the Academy's top-ranked elite. She sat there exactly once, ate her meal in total, unbroken silence, surrounded by their curious faces, and never sat there again. She went right back to her isolated corner table, entirely alone, where she could keep her back to the wall and clearly see every single exit. It was Selith who finally managed to crack through the girl's terrifying, reinforced psychological wall. 3 nights after the violent demonstration, Kira sat rigidly in their cramped dormitory, staring blankly at a tactical analysis on her data pad. Selith watched her from the corner of her eye. The human girl had barely spoken a single word since stepping out of the arena. She ate, she studied, she trained, she functioned like a perfect machine, but something was wound dangerously tight inside her chest. Selith could see it in the microscopic way Kira's hands violently trembled when she believed no one was looking. "You do not have to be strong right now," Selith whispered softly into the quiet room. "Not in here, not with me." Kira did not look up from the glowing screen. "I am fine." "You are not fine," Selith pushed. "You just fought the creature who killed your mother in front of 3,000 people, and you won. That is not something a person walks away from and feels fine." Kira's hand abruptly stopped moving across the data pad. Her jaw locked tight, the muscles corded, and her shoulders went completely rigid. She looked like a frayed steel wire stretched to its absolute, catastrophic limit. "I did not know if I would win," Kira finally said, her voice shattering into something quiet, barely more than a ragged breath. "I studied him for 6 weeks. I knew every weakness, every limitation, every flaw in his technique." She swallowed hard, staring at the holographic projector. "But when I stepped onto that floor and looked up at him, all that armor, all that size, all that history. I thought about my mother standing at that wall, looking at the same thing, knowing she was not going to survive." Selith held her breath and waited. "I was not afraid of being hurt," Kira confessed, her voice fracturing. "I was afraid of failing her, of standing where she stood and falling the same way, of proving them right, that we are soft, that we break, that we are nothing." A single tear broke free and ran down her bruised cheek. She wiped it away quickly, angrily, as if the biological response had deeply betrayed her. Selith crossed the small metal room, sat beside the terrifying Death Wielder, and wrapped all 4 of her slender arms around her. It was a clumsy, awkward embrace, the biomechanical angles entirely wrong, but Kira finally collapsed into it, letting the impenetrable wall come crashing down. "You did not fail anyone," Selith whispered. "You did not fail her." The very next evening, the massive Dorvac ducked his heavy head to enter the cramped dormitory. In his huge, stone-gray hands, he carried a small, incredibly smooth dark gray stone. A single word had been meticulously carved into its surface in careful, angular human script. "This is a memory stone," the giant rumbled gently. "My people give them to those we consider family. I carved the word myself. It is in your language." He held it out. Kira took it. The stone was still warm from his massive hands, heavy and grounding. The word carved into the dark surface was painfully simple: endure. Kira looked up at the towering alien, and for the absolute first time since she had arrived on Station Valith 9, she smiled. It was small, exhausted, and incredibly real. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice carrying the most raw emotion anyone had ever heard from her. The systemic consequences of that single fight violently reshaped the galaxy's political architecture. Earth's provisional, mocked seat on the Galactic Concord was officially upgraded to full, permanent membership within 2 weeks. The humiliating single-student limit at the elite academy was permanently lifted by a rare unanimous vote. Bureaucrats issued formal statements recognizing humanity as a species of significant strategic and cultural value, which translated in plain language to, "We were wrong about them." On the first day of the next cycle, 14 new human students arrived at Station Valith 9. They came from every battered continent on Earth. They walked through the massive docking bay with their heads up, and not a single alien student moved to block their path. Kira met them at the desk, handing out their data cards. A nervous boy from Lagos looked at her and asked if she was the Kira Vasquez from the viral video. "I am Kira," she said quietly. "The rest does not matter." Far across the station, locked inside a sterile holding room, Breth Kelzer sat completely alone, stripped of his ceremonial gear, his rank insignia, and his pride. He stared out the viewport, waiting for the transport that would carry him to his tribunal. A young Kathani officer entered to deliver the legal documents, hesitating at the door to ask what it was actually like fighting the human. Breth stared at the cold, indifferent stars. "I have fought across 12 systems," he said hollowly. "I have killed soldiers from 9 species." His throat markings flickered a dull, exhausted gray, "but I have never been hunted before." The young officer frowned in confusion. "Hunted?" "She did not fight me," Breth said, turning to look at the boy with haunted eyes. "I thought she was fighting. I thought she was reacting, defending, surviving, but she was not doing any of those things. From the first day she walked into my classroom, she was hunting me, and I did not know it until I was already on the ground." He looked back out into the endless black. "Do not underestimate humans. They are not what anyone thought they were." That night the station was entirely quiet. Selith slept, her bioluminescence pulsing softly in the dark. On the metal shelf, Dorvak's heavy memory stone sat right beside the glowing holographic photo of Elena Vasquez. Kira sat in the dark, her data pad illuminating her face, displaying the roster of the 14 new human names. She looked at the names, then up at her mother's tired, smiling face, eyes that had seen too much horror but still believed in something worth protecting. "We are here, Mom," Kira whispered into the silence, "and we are not going anywhere." She lay back and closed her eyes. Outside the heavy viewport station, Valith 9 turned slowly against the cold, endless void, and far beyond it, growing closer with every passing day, a small blue planet spun in the light of its star, scarred, wild, incredibly dangerous, and fiercely alive. It was a death world. It was a cradle of hunters. It was home. And the galaxy, to its absolute, terrifying core, was finally beginning to understand exactly what that meant.